I think if you had asked me this question 5, 7 years ago, I think I would be raising the clamor in almost like a shouting from the rooftops way, right? Like tell everybody you know, why can't you understand it? Don't you see how dire these issues are?
This is a podcast called Walk, Talk, Listen. An attempt to connect people and make this world a bit better by sharing opinions and experiences based on the belief that everyone's perspective is true, albeit partial. My name is Maurice Bloem, and I would like to welcome you to yet another episode of Walk, Talk, Listen. Hey, good day, everybody. This is another episode of the podcast Walk, Talk, Listen. And as always, I'm delighted with today's guest who will introduce himself. Nikhil, please go ahead.
Great. Well, thank you, Maurice. My name is Nikhil Bumb, and I work in the space of corporate social impact, corporate purpose, sustainability. But I work for a nonprofit called FSG. We were started by Michael Porter and Mark Kramer back in 2000 to support organizations working towards equitable systems change. And we primarily do that by working with companies and with foundations. And I lead our work in the US supporting companies as they think about their impact work.
And where are you based?
I'm based in Washington, D.C.
Okay, so on the East Coast, so we're in the same time zone. And
We are.
say very, really interesting work, and I would like to know much more about it. But you told me before we started recording that you did listen to a couple of episodes, so thank you for that. Then you also know that me and the listeners are also very interested in where were you born and where were you raised, and how might that have influenced on what you're doing now, and where did you study?
Yeah. Well, Maurice, I was born in Laramie, Wyoming,
Mm-hmm.
which generally gets a reaction out of most people because not everyone has met anyone who is born in, let alone is from Wyoming. And I think in particular, often folks who, I know this is a podcast, so your listeners can't see me, but I'm a South Asian man, a South Asian American man. And so often when folks see me, they are even more shocked when they hear that I'm born in Wyoming. So I think it would be helpful probably to start off by saying that I'm the son of two Indian immigrants, and my parents migrated from Northwest India in the state of Rajasthan. They migrated from fairly rural settings to Wyoming in the late 70s and early 80s. And so they migrated. My father came for his graduate work. He went back and married my mother and brought her over a few years later. And so I was born in Wyoming, but right around the age of 2, we moved, or when I was 2, we moved to Greenville, South Carolina, which is where I grew up. And
Okay.
so my parents are still based in South Carolina, and I have never been back to Wyoming. So, while I was born there, I really call myself that I'm from South Carolina.
Yeah. Yeah. And do you have any siblings?
I do. I have 2 older sisters.
Okay. And where
Yeah.
where were they born? Also in Wyoming.
One was born in India. The
Okay.
eldest was born in India, and my other sister was also born in Wyoming. And yeah.
Okay. And so tell a bit about your life in South Carolina. Yeah.
Yeah. So growing up, I think what I learned about my life in South Carolina, I learned a lot about it, or I got it was put into perspective after I
Mhm.
left South Carolina. So, I completed high school and then I moved to New Jersey for college. And I think then I started to learn, put some things in perspective. So, first of all, for folks who may not be familiar with South Carolina, it is a fairly diverse state, but it also, as much of the United States, there's also a lot of things that follow along racial lines. Second, being the son of immigrants, that also comes with its own implications in the South. And while I attended public school, There were some things that I learned later on were perhaps not as kosher in a public school. So, for example, we used to regularly say prayers before school games. I was on the high school tennis team, and it was not uncommon to say a prayer or to say amen and a little blessing before games. I learned when I went up north for college from my friends that was they were shocked to know that. They were also shocked to know that that happened in public school and that didn't that wasn't okay. But that was part of life in the South, right? Religion is a big part of life in the South. You see it very prominently, and in particular, you see the Christian faith very prominently in the South. It was also not uncommon for me to for us to get folks who were trying to proselytize at our knocking at
Mm,
our door, or to have folks in school ask me if I was saved, or to ask very inquisitive questions and sometimes somewhat insulting questions
mm,
about my background, whether that's my ethnicity, whether that's my culture, or often my religion. And at that point, it's so the Greenville, South Carolina area looks quite different now. It was
mhm,
still pretty cosmopolitan and diverse then, but it was a growing South Asian community. Now it's quite vast. And so, over the course of my time, that I can remember, probably went from about 30 to 40 South Asian families in that community to when I left for college, there were probably a couple of hundred. Now we're probably talking in the thousands, and so it's
mm.
grown quite a bit. So you can imagine, what that might sort of look like. Yeah.
Okay. And well, I didn't. Well, I know some people who are living in South Carolina, North Carolina, but I never heard that. Or maybe I did not ask the right questions. Um, so 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 why did you go to New Jersey? And
Sure.
yeah.
Yeah. So I went for college. I
Mm-hmm,
studied at Princeton University for my undergrad, and I studied
mm-hmm.
electrical engineering. And it was one of these common
Why did you go into that direction?
into engineering. I loved
Yeah.
science. I loved science. I
Okay.
loved math
Was
growing
that
up.
something you got from your parents, or just how did that come about?
Yeah, I think it definitely came from my parents. My
Hmm.
parents both come from a STEM background. So my father
Okay.
is also an engineer. My father is a chemical and environmental engineer. My mom is a science student. She studied botany and chemistry. So I think the influence certainly came from them. There was a big emphasis on STEM careers. I think you see that generally in a lot of immigrant communities, particularly from South Asia. And it certainly has helped when both of your parents come from a STEM background as well. I discovered early on that medicine was not the route for me. I really disliked doing dissections in high school
Mm,
biology. I don't think I had the stomach for it. I don't think I had the stomach for it when I had to get even minor procedures done medically. And so it was pretty clear that medicine wasn't going to be the route for me. And so engineering felt like the next best option. And in particular because I loved math, I loved physics, I loved chemistry. And so I was considering a lot of different options within engineering. I did not really know how to decide between them. And perhaps, in the little bit of rebellion that I may have had going to college, because my father studied chemical engineering, I thought, let me try the other one that might be interesting to me, which was electrical engineering. And if I don't like it, I'll switch to chemical. But my father also very wisely told me that chemical engineering is not about chemistry. And so just because you liked chemistry in high school doesn't mean that's what chemical engineering is. So I tried electrical engineering. I liked it,
mm,
and I stuck with it.
okay. Um, and your sisters, both your sisters, which direction did they go?
They also went the STEM route. Both
Okay.
of them studied biomedical engineering.
Yeah.
One of them continued in graduate work in biomedical engineering, ultimately got her PhD, did her postdoc in it. She's actually a Marshall Scholar, so she was jointly
Mm,
working doing her graduate work between the UK at Oxford and then the NIH in the Washington, D.C. area. She went on to start a biotech startup.
mm,
And now she works in the science policy realm and is also based in the DC area. The other sister went from doing biomedical engineering onto medical school and is now a transplant nephrologist.
Wow. Wow. It's very impressive, all of it. Uh, so Nikhil, but you did not go in further in that direction, right? Because you work now.
In a
Yeah.
totally different space.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
No, it's
Oh, wait. Sorry.
sure.
Before we go there, a question about actually still South Carolina. So because you said about the prayer, obviously you are your parents and probably you as well are from a different religious background.
That's true. Yeah.
So
So
yeah.
we all belong to a religion called Jainism.
Mhm.
And Maurice, are you familiar with Jainism, or do you think your listeners might be familiar with Jainism? Should I explain
My
it a little
listeners,
bit?
I'm not 100% sure. So
Sure.
maybe it's good to yeah.
Sure. It's a relatively, I would say, smaller
Mhm.
faith that not many folks are familiar with, and you may have interacted with Jains and not known about it. Culturally, we're quite similar to Hindus, and many times it is confused that, we are Hindus or that we are a part of Hinduism. But Jainism is its own faith. We're a small faith. We also ascribe to what we call the dharmic traditions. So similar to the other dharmic traditions are Hinduism and Buddhism. And so some of the commonalities is there is a belief in karma and this concept that every deed that you are doing, your soul is accumulating karma, either good or bad. And that based on how that accumulates, there's also a cycle of reincarnation. And so you get reborn based off of your karma as different types of beings. But where it differs from from Hinduism and Buddhism is there isn't a formal concept of a god. So there are what we call tirthankars, which are spiritual beings. They have often played a very important role in helping revive the religion or teach, and they have great spiritual teachings. But they aren't looked as gods because they have freed themselves. They have attained salvation. They have attained nirvana or moksha. And so, because they freed themselves from the cycle of birth or death, you can't pray to them because they are no longer in existence. And so, that's why there isn't a formal concept of a god. And then, maybe the third thing I like to tell folks about Jainism is a couple of the central tenets. And so, the two ones that I talk about most, because I think they're also the ones that drive a lot of what guides me on a day-to-day basis. One is ahimsa or nonviolence. And so most or all Jains are, if you're practicing, are going to be vegetarian. And that's one of the most common and obvious ways in which we ascribe to ahimsa or nonviolence. But that shows up in many other ways. It's not just supposed to be in your actions and what you eat, but also in the way you think. It's supposed to guide your thought. It's supposed to guide what you say, and it's supposed to guide your actions. And then the second principle that I talk a lot about is anekantvad. And so that's often translated as non-absolutism or multiplicity of views. And so this idea that we are all looking at the same picture from different perspectives. And so we're all holding parts of the truth, but no one is fully holding the entire truth. And so how can we, even where it seems like we may be differing in perspective or in opinion and quite in conflict with each other, understand that it's because we're looking at a central truth from different perspectives.
You know, especially for the listeners have followed this particular series for a while now. They often heard me say that. I'm quoting a philosopher, Ken Wilber, saying nobody can be wrong 100% of the time. So so everybody has something to add, right? So
I love that.
and thanks for that explanation. And I have some questions about your faith later when you talk about the work that you're doing now. But maybe the last question about your upbringing in the South Carolina is so was it difficult then to to pursue, how do you say that? It's not pursue, to live by your religion in such an environment? Were you the only family? Were there more? Was it a community, or was it how was that?
I think it was difficult and it wasn't.
Mm-hmm.
I think some of it is when you're a child and you're young and you don't know that much different. You don't know perhaps how difficult it is. I would be curious how my parents might answer that question because I would suspect that it was difficult from their perspective.
Mm.
Um, and then there are aspects where I know it was difficult. So maybe I'll answer your question about the community and then come back to some of the pieces that made it difficult. Um, so like I said, it was a relatively small South Asian community. There was definitely a much bigger Hindu community, but there was a small Jain community. I think when I was in middle school and high school, we used to do a little Jain study group, and we'd bring together, I think it was like 10, maybe max 15 families, and that was probably the core of the community.
Mm.
We had a joint, and we would do that, on Sundays. I forget if it was weekly or bi-weekly, but we do that with some regularity. But that was the core of the community. We didn't have our own sort of center or temple that we went to. It was a joint Hindu and Jain temple that we went to. And I think this is also why, because they're culturally similar, and because many of my South Asian friends were Hindu, I think, I also grew up knowing a lot about Hinduism, celebrating a lot of their holidays and festivals. And for a while, I didn't really see, I mean, I knew where some of the lines were, and I knew that I was Jain, but to me, I sort of thought of it all as one giant community. Coming back to your question about was it hard? I think yes, to some degree. I think it's hard to, I think it's hard to, I would suspect again for my parents, right, to think about how are you really going to preserve and pass this on to your children. And I honestly admire what they have done because maybe at times when we were learning the language or when we were learning some of the scriptures and things, that felt a little bit more like we were, it felt harder for us because it felt like it was almost to some degree, I don't forced, not necessarily in a very negative context, but you have to sit down and actually like practice your alphabets and all of that. On the flip side, though, I think that because it was a small community, I've seen this with a lot of, and compared to folks who grew up in a bigger community in other parts of the US, I think there's a greater push to actually preserve to preserve the culture because my hypothesis is that you don't think that there will be as many touch points because you don't have as big of a community. So there's a greater emphasis on it in the home. And I think I really saw that. So we didn't necessarily do all the rituals that I sometimes see some of my Jain friends who grew up in, again, bigger communities doing. Part of that, it's because we come also from a sect of Jainism that's a little bit less about temple worship. Um, and it's more about sort of daily practice in your own life. But then thinking about that from outside of the house, it did feel difficult. So, for example, it was not an uncommon occurrence for somebody especially in middle and high school. I remember there was this period of years we'd all sit together in the cafeteria for lunchtime. Those are anyways awkward years, whether it's like the locker room in the gym class or it's, cafeteria and lunchtime and other, changes that you're going through as a teenager. But it was not uncommon for folks to make comments about the food that we would bring because we often brought, Indian food. I had several times when folks would try to make me, without realizing it, eat a piece of meat. So people would regularly like put meat in my food, and as far as I'm aware, I caught it every single time, because I saw it before it happened and before I ever took a bite. Like I said, folks were regularly trying to convert you. That would happen, even when we go away for like a leadership camp for, like a community service camp for folks of different community service groups for extracurriculars in high school. So, I think in that sense, it was difficult. And of course, you are the outsider, and so you get made fun of or picked on or bullied. So,
That was so sad to hear these things. I'm sorry that you had to go through that. Yeah, we're going fast through your life. So let us jump back to New Jersey.
that's okay.
And yeah, so you are into electro-engineering, but you ultimately end up with FSG, right? With the company you work for. So can you maybe tell us in a quick way how did you get there? How was that path?
Yeah. And I have to say, of course, because we are crossing the personal and the professional in this, I have to say, of course, that any views I talk about related to religion are solely mine and not that of FSG's.
Yeah.
But yeah, so how did I get from electrical engineering to doing social impact consulting with companies at
Mhm.
FSG? So I was pretty confused about what part of electrical engineering I wanted to focus on. I liked almost every aspect of it, with the exception of a few. And so I didn't know going in when I was
Mhm.
nearing the end of college and my bachelor's what I'd want to focus on until I took a course on imaging. And a big portion of that course focused on medical imaging. And there was a little bit of a click in my mind of this isn't creating a new technology for the sake of new technology. And I know I'm sort of downplaying what electrical engineers do, but it was, there was a higher purpose. You're trying to solve a need. You're trying to make someone's life better through these medical images or the medical imaging technology through other medical technologies. So I actually pursued that. I went on to get a graduate degree. So I went from Princeton to Georgia Tech, moved back down south, very close to home in Atlanta, and did graduate work in electrical engineering, all focused on medical applications. And from there, I decided I would go to work for healthcare and life science companies because of this passion around, the medical
Mhm.
applications. And I worked for a consulting company called ZS Associates, and we were doing a variety of work for life science companies, but mostly in the realm of thinking about their strategies, commercial strategies, and their analytics work. And for me, that was a real exposure to what does it mean to work for companies that are trying to bring innovations to the world that can solve problems, and what goes well and where are their limitations. And so in many ways, I loved a lot of the aspects of consulting. Clearly, I've stayed a consultant for most of my career. But what I also felt missing was that because we were working on commercial strategy, I didn't see as much intentionality in thinking about how do you bring those innovations that address medical needs to actually then think about improving the full system and thinking about where are there disparities in the way healthcare happens and how can you get to those who are perhaps suffering the worst healthcare outcomes. And it wasn't that I felt that our companies, our clients weren't thinking about that. It was more that I felt that they were leaving opportunity on the table, and
Mhm.
because there wasn't intentionality in thinking about it, it wasn't happening
Mhm.
as much as it could. And so that for me was a pivot. And it was a pivot to think about, a pivot to think about, hey, what are the business models to do so? And that is where I sort of made this transition. The parallel thing, Maurice, though, at the same time, at the same time that I was anyways wanting to make that transition and I was
Mhm.
going through those questions in my mind, I lost a very dear friend of mine from
Mhm.
back in India. Um, and in many ways, I think he was only about a year and a half older than me.
Mhm.
So he was shy of his 25th birthday.
Wow.
And it was due to, you never really know, right? But there were
Mhm.
issues around access to adequate quality healthcare that I believe, perhaps it could have been preventable because he was in the hospital. It was in the hospital, and there was a staff shortage, and he passed away. So
That's terrible. And and was that in India or was it in the US?
that was in India.
Okay.
Yeah, and so for me, it was sort of these two things happening at the
Mhm.
same time.
Mhm.
I was anyways questioning things about my career, and there was this reminder
Yeah.
that access and healthcare, again, innovation by itself does not mean that folks will get the care that they need. And so, how do you think about the models and the systems that are holding those problems into place, but the models that can address that? And what is the role of companies to do so? So that was my pivot. That was my transition. And I've done that since. I'll sort of fast forward. I'm telling this and I've been telling it in great detail. But for me, that was the major pivot. So I've now done that both in-house at companies and helping them think about what does it mean to launch and start a social business. And I've done it as an advisor or consultant. So
Okay.
I was at Medtronic and I helped them think about a business model around low cost, appropriate medical technology for emerging markets. And then I was also at Deloitte helping them start a social impact practice. And then between Deloitte and FSG, I actually moved out to Kenya for a bit, and I was working with an
Oh.
international NGO called Technoserve, and we were doing
Mhm.
some work with their corporate partners, mostly all in the agricultural space. Did one project around financial inclusion for farmers, did another project around sustainable agriculture and sustainable sourcing for some of their corporate partners. And then I moved back to the US and took this opportunity with FSG, where I've now been for the last 9 years.
Mm.
And so yeah, that's how I ended up where I am.
Okay. Um, okay, and I have a lot of questions pop up in my head. Let me try to link something. Go back to your religion. And because you were explaining what made you pivot, right? And what was the role of your faith within that? And especially then, how is your faith, your belief, how is that influencing your perspective on economic models? Because that's an economic systems.
Yeah, it's a great question. Again, I think this tells itself better in retrospect than when it was actually happening. So I'm going to try to think about it from the way that when it was actually happening. And I think it shows up in a few different ways. One is there's an inherent service aspect to Jainism. It's a lot about thinking about us as a collective, recognizing that you're part of something bigger, you're part of the system. How do you not be selfish? How do you think about others? How do you, hold different perspectives together, right? There are a lot of those inherent aspects. So I think without realizing it, those values had been playing into how I just showed up as an individual, as a person in day to day. When I started questioning some of those other choices around what is the work I'm doing, is it actually helping address some of the big needs that are, I think then I started to think about it with a little bit more intentionality. But I'd still say relatively naive in how advanced that thinking is, at least to where it influences my thinking today and recognizing the connection. Maybe the third parallel track that was going on is I was also getting increasingly involved in interfaith work starting
Mm.
from college onwards. So when I was in college, when I was at Princeton, I joined on the encouragement of a few friends and a very influential dean in my life, what's called the Religious Life Council at Princeton. It's an interfaith council that brings together students from a number of different faith backgrounds. And even if you aren't ascribing to a faith, if you're atheist or you don't belong to any religion, it's also okay. But the idea is, how do you come together? How do you think about what it means to hold these different perspectives together? How do you learn from each other? And how do you foster dialogue and understanding and community? And the dean, Paul Rauschenbusch, who led that council, has ended up becoming very influential for me, not just because he was part of that council. He's just also, I think embodies a lot of what leadership looks like to me, and thinking about different backgrounds and how do you, especially for those who are marginalized, and how to make sure that things are inclusive and you create inclusive spaces for meaningful and productive dialogue. Because the dialogue we'd have on this council, as great as it sounds, like to have that many people come together, it may sound very harmonious. We actually had people disagree quite a bit. That my faith says X, your faith says Y. These are inherently at a difference with each other. And so that, again, was my first exposure to interfaith work, besides, just growing up in a mixed faith community, but doing it with more intentionality. And so I continued to, after college, do that. So, he moved on from Princeton to help the Huffington Post start a help start their religion site. He invited me, he was trying to build a youth authorship and youth readership. And so he invited me to provide a young Jain perspective on that platform. Through the interfaith work that we were doing, I got connected to Religions for Peace. I got connected to the Parliament for the World's Religion, which is how I met our mutual friend, Michael Trice. And so that has been another thread going on. And I think that and in particular, the work of the Parliament of the World's Religions, which now I serve on the board of, is really about how do you look at interfaith spaces, interfaith dialogue, interfaith understanding, but apply them to issues of social justice. And so for me, when I joined the board, back in 2016 for the first time. I was on the board from 2016 to 2018, and then I again just recently rejoined it. For me, this was when my professional world, personal world, were all starting to blend a lot more, right? Because we were working on social justice issues or social and environmental causes at work. And a lot of the things that I have held just operating in my day-to-day life from my personal faith background and what guided my values, there is now this conduit between those and thinking about what does faith look like to drive towards social justice. And it was sort of this nice, almost bridge between those by serving on that board and being in those spaces.
It is a small world, because you were alluding also to the Religions for Peace, which is a close partner of JLI, the organization that I work for at the moment. So, and yes, our mutual friend is Michael Trice. So, okay, then so the work that you have to do, right? You work for companies that I think many of them, their main goal is growth and profit. I mean, tell me if I'm wrong. So how did they look at you? When you start coming up with this, I think different perspective, and something that my assumption is that they don't necessarily have thought about. And
You'd be surprised. So often they are coming to us because they've at least thought about it to some degree. They may not have thought about it as much about being tied to their core business, but they are thinking about what it means to be a responsible citizen in the world. They're thinking about their employees. They're thinking about what does it mean to be a good steward in the communities in which they have operations. They're thinking, almost all companies do some degree of philanthropic work, some giving back, some local charities, right? It may look very different at different organizations. So many times when they're coming to us, that's a starting place for the conversation. But then where we really push them to think about is how can you make this part of your core ethos? How do you think about becoming what we call a purpose-driven or a purpose-led company? And that purpose shouldn't be shy, as you said, right, Maurice, around pursuing growth, 100% pursue growth, pursue profit, but also look to do that by serving some sort of a societal purpose, right? It should be authentic. It should be significant in this problem that you're trying to solve, the social and environmental problem. And it should also be profitable for you. Again, we don't shy away from talking about it in that way, and it should be serious. It should help you drive decision making. And the way we talk to them about it is that can show up in a variety of ways. You live into your purpose, yes, in the way you do your corporate social responsibility, your citizenship work, your philanthropy. It also shows up in the ways you treat your employees, how you do hiring, how you think about retention, how you think about your talent philosophy, your norms, your culture, and your relationships with your suppliers, your other partners. But where it's perhaps most powerful, or one of the ways that in which it's most powerful, is when it also is part of the way that you create revenue and value. And that there's a real opportunity by tying it closely, what we call shared value, tying the social impact you're creating, putting a direct link between the social impact and your business growth, whether that's top line or bottom line growth, and using that to create a virtuous cycle so that the growth that you're capturing as a business can be fueled back to scale, to innovate, so that you achieve greater impact and continue to grow as a business. And so when you position it that way, I think you see this conversation starts to change with business leaders. They see it as an opportunity to both, to think about their legacy and to think about how this can be a real differentiating factor, a source of sort of a unique value proposition, a competitive advantage for them.
Thanks for that, Nico. You told us that you've been working with FSG for 9 years. Do you approach your work now at the moment differently than when you started? Because there's a lot happening in the world, right? We talk about what I always try to highlight is, as a world, we identified 17 sustainable development goals, and we are far away from them. We should reach them before 2030. you're only at 15 to 70%. So, at least my thinking in terms of sustainability has changed, and how are we going to do this? How is that? Yeah. How did it go for you within this organization, within the job you're asked to do? Are you still look the same at issues that you need to tackle, or did it change? Yeah, walk us through that.
I think in terms of the issues we tackle, they are the same, right? Like we're still focused on healthcare and education, environmental sustainability, economic opportunity, mobility. But I think the way we talk about them has evolved. So one, we now talk about systems level work a lot more. We're not shy about saying that these problems are held in place by structures and systems that we have designed as humanity. Maybe not our current folks, right? A lot of these have been designed decades or centuries ago, but we can't shy away from talking about that. And to really create the lasting change that folks want to, we have to be able to talk about those problems and where there is room or not for you as an organization to work on that. That's one way in which it's changed. I think the second way in which it's changed is that we are also looking differently at our role in influencing change. So as an organization, we are thinking a lot more about not just creating the strategy, but what are the other things outside of strategy that you need to work on? A lot of this work, particularly say in the corporate realm, we talk about purpose and we talk about multiple elements around purpose. But one of the really key ones is that you need culture. You need a culture that embodies that purpose. And you can really sort of feel it palpably when you're talking to employees of that company, when you're at the organization, you can almost feel those values and that purpose alive there. And you've probably heard that phrase, culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? So we are a strategy consulting organization. That's where we got our roots. We were started by one of the gurus of strategy, Michael Porter. And we also know that this work is about a lot more. And so in the last couple of years in particular, we've been focusing a lot on that aspect. And in particular, when we're talking about these strategies related to equity, related to systems change, related to sustainability, we know that interferences, there are things that get in the way. So we talk about the interferences. So we say a colleague of mine, Bobby Silton, she has come up with this equation that we use quite frequently, which is that your strategic intent minus the interferences, and interferences can be both internal and external, is equal to your impact. And so what we mean by that is your strategic intent, that's your strategy. We often set this nice strategy for a company, but the impact that they're able to create doesn't actually meet what that strategy is. And that's because things are getting in the way. And that's both internal and external. And so how do you identify those interferences? Or first, just see them. Second, then identify them, put a more precise name to them. And then third, create enabling conditions to help mitigate them. And a lot of that is really talking about how do you set that container? How do you think about the culture? How do you make sure that you have the relationships? So I think that's the second aspect in the way that the work has changed. And the third is I think there's an increasingly strong focus for myself, and therefore in the ways that I work with my colleagues and where I work with my client organizations or partners on individual leadership. And what does it mean? I think we have to rethink the way or what it means to be a business leader, a leader in any organization, even outside of a company, a for-profit company. What does it mean to be a leader in government, in a nonprofit? I think we have to rethink that. I think the model's a little bit broken, if I'm being very honest. And I say that fully conscious that I'm also somebody who went back and got a business degree. I got an MBA at some point, and I learned what does that mean in terms of what it means to be a leader. And again, I think it's one of those places where it's not intentionally that we are trying to miss out on teaching folks about that. I just think we have missed something in thinking about leadership, and it's an incomplete model.
No, fascinating what you mentioned around the culture and then individual leadership. It reminds me, and because I sent you a couple of topics that I wanted to talk about in advance. I'm always interested in talking about sustainable development goals and why we are not reaching those, why we are behind. And this growing group of people identified, one of the reasons is that we are not paying proper attention to the ability, skills, and knowledge as an individual as well as a community. So that's where you have your individual as well as your culture, right, and values. I asked you to check the inner development goals out. Any reaction on the inner development goals, and is it something that you are working on without even maybe realizing it, that you're touching upon that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for putting this on my radar. I did not know about the inner development goals. I obviously knew about the SDGs. I knew about the sustainable goals. We actually talk about that a lot with our companies.
Yeah.
We say, hey, link your purpose to specific UN SDGs that you're trying to solve. I didn't know about the inner development goals, but it's interesting to see them. They all resonate. I think they talk about a lot of those values that we all hold that we were talking about earlier as well. And I think the things that maybe I will comment on in specific, and the way that I've perhaps, as to your question, was I sort of using them without realizing it? I think yes, right? So, one, thinking a lot about how I show up in my, as I've showed up and evolved as a professional, from when I was a project manager to now, leading at a senior level projects. I think I have found comfort both in talking about the importance of the inner work and also being more vulnerable in sharing with others why you need to think about that, why it's important, and trying to model those tough moments when I'm struggling myself with my teams, because there is a connection. We talk about that when we hear about belonging at work. That is a big conversation. Psychological safety is a big conversation, right? So there are a variety of things in which you're hearing this show up in the general vernacular in a professional space much more, but perhaps not with this language. It's interesting, actually, in 2021, when we saw during the pandemic and then the racial reckoning that happened in the US and abroad, with that was, really catalyzed in part by the murder of George Floyd, along with a number of other Black Americans. We got a lot of requests from companies to talk about how they've become much more intentional about working to advance or address racial equity and go beyond their typical measures from like an HR and a talent perspective. And in the course of that work, after a couple of years, I wrote this blog that was largely for myself than anything else. But it was sort of an opportunity to capture my own thoughts about inner work and how that shows up and why it's hard to do this work if you're not actually working on yourself as well. Because I think, when we talk about systems change, we talk about multiple conditions of systems change. And the one that's most transformative and sits at the bottom of this pyramid is mindsets or mental models. And I think that inner work gets to that. If you're not working on your mindset, the rest of the change is limited. And so I think that this concept, this framework gets in that same way. The other way that I think about it is we also talk about conscious leadership with our, whether it's again with our own colleagues or with companies. And when you go into the literature on conscious leadership, it talks about multiple aspects of leadership again, right? So, and this is what I mean, coming back to what I was talking about earlier, where I think that perhaps models for leadership that are taught in school or taught in professional trainings are incomplete. I think we overemphasize a highly masculine and somewhat toxically masculine form of leadership, but we also place we overemphasize and place a higher weight on analytical intelligence, right? We all hear about IQ. We know that's important. And not to say that it's not important, but we often, like, that's the primary thing that has often been, for many years and decades, valued in executives. Increasingly, I think in the past decade or so, you've heard a resurgence around emotional intelligence and why it's also important to have EQ in being a good leader and what that looks like. But I think there's still a sort of jury out in terms of how well that's been taken up. The things that we hear less about that I see more in frameworks like inner development goals or conscious leadership is thinking about spiritual intelligence as well as systems intelligence. And I think to really truly drive change that we're looking for in the sustainable goals, those things really matter. One, how do you connect this back to your values and how well you uphold them or not? That's a lot of the spiritual or moral intelligence. And the systems intelligence is that ability to think about and see how all these pieces are interconnected. And I think this is where that's sometimes a little bit odd with analytical intelligence, is that often analytical intelligence looks for shortcuts to find linear pathways between things. But systems intelligence really recognizes that actually these things are non-linear. And so you have to be able to see the interconnectedness and how these all play a role together. And I think if we were able to think about leadership in that way, you would, one, see a greater ability to do the inner work, and two, to then actually drive the change.
No, yeah, thanks. I'm bringing it also back to Jainism. I think there also you see, if I have done my homework properly, a connection between humans and planet, all life, right? So if you take that into consideration, how do you deal with that when you're working in systems that tend to think about humans but not necessarily about planet?
It's a great question. And I don't know that I always do it well, if I'm being very honest, Maurice. I think it's an area of growth, and it's an area where I've been trying to push myself to learn more. I think it's easier to do it from for me, I'll say this, right? Like it's easier to study it almost from an academic perspective, right? I've been doing work in sustainable agriculture for over a decade. I can easily talk to any organization, whether a nonprofit or a company, about why it's important, give you all the data, give you all the evidence. I think it's harder to turn that into practice for myself in my daily life, right? Where are there areas where I can cut back? That being said, there are also areas to leverage that I do know, right? So as you said, it is inherent to Jainism to think about the connection between humans and the planet, to see that there's life in everything. So one of the things I really appreciate about Jainism, connecting even a further dot, it's a very science-based religion. So we talk about multiple senses. So humans are 5 sense beings. We all know our 5 senses. But we talk about there's also 4 sense beings, 3 sense beings, 2 sense being, 1 sense being. So we talk about, and because the nonviolence thing, take it to its nth degree. Therefore, you try to minimize how many times you kill anything, no matter if there are 1 sense, 2 sense, 3 sense, 4 sense, 5 sense being. So that means bacteria, that means plants, that means animals. So that's one of the reasons that we don't eat animals or we don't eat meat, is because they are a higher sensed being. And therefore you can't not kill any, right? Just by breathing, just by washing our hands, we are killing some bacteria. So you can't, but how do you minimize the harm that you're creating? And so when you start to think about it that way, at least for me personally, what it meant is I sort of realized, okay, there are things that I'm already doing. How can I then start to do baby steps, right? We often try to jump really towards that end goal. And for me, in my daily practice, okay, how can I start to think a little bit more? Where can I cut back? And it starts with things that, as a child, I heard my father tell me all the time, or my mom tell me all the time, right? Like turn the electricity off when you leave the room. We don't need as many clothes. Why, don't amass too much materialism, right? And then how do you then start to translate those things into daily practice, but then also build a bigger change and think about that? And so if you think about that in the work of a company, I think it works both like also, yes, like work on what needs to happen sustainability outside of your company as well, but also get your own house in order. How do you think about the sustainability in your operations, and where are there small practices that you can then lead to, okay, yes, this is doable, I can do it, and then it makes the bigger practices even easier.
Let us continue talking about you. Actually, you started it. So if I ask you, and we talked about this before we started. Many guests find this the most difficult question. If I ask you to choose a song or a piece of music that best represents, for a big part, who you are, what you are about, which song would that be and why?
So I appreciated that you sent the questions in advance, and this is the one that gave me the most pause. And it's not big, it's because I don't feel, I think you worded the question, at least what you sent ahead of time, as like, what's your signature song? You worded it slightly differently now, but I don't know that I have one. Well, I love music. I'm listening to music almost all the time. I'm one of those people, at least in college, right, who, there are folks who need complete silence to work and to study, and I'm somebody who like needs to have music going on, needs background noise. And so to some degree, I feel like I'm always collecting new music and there's always music playing, but it means I don't have one thing that like I really sort of is my go-to song or things. I think at different times, based on my mood, they're songs that really speak to me. I think right now maybe I'll share two songs that came to mind, and I tried not to make this too difficult of a question, so that sort of immediately came to mind when I saw your question, and once I gave myself the permission to not go through the task of choosing a signature song. So the first, so they're both from this wider sort of music project called Coke Studio, which where Coca-Cola is sponsoring, bringing different artists together to from within a tradition, but often like different genres or sometimes across borders together. So the first is a song called Symphony, and it was done on their global platform, and it is a collaboration between Imagine Dragons and Inner City Youth Orchestra of Los Angeles. And it just has great messages around harmony, around coming together, around overcoming difficulty, both on a personal and a societal level. And so I think that is a song that I really enjoy. It's also just got a great beat. And so it's fun to listen to. I've gotten my niece into it as well. And so sometimes when I am taking her to school or driving her around, we listen and sing to it together. And then the second song is one that they recently released from their India platform, and it's a song for the upcoming Indian festival of Holi, which is actually on March 14th. And they brought together again different artists, but and several from Rajasthan, which is a state that I belong to, and the video also brings together a Kathak dancer. And it's a song about Holi, which is it's a celebration of color. It's a celebration of spring, the changing of times. It's a harvest. There's many reasons folks celebrate Holi, and it's just a vibrant song that really, it just feels full of life. And so I think those two songs right now sort of are really speaking to me.
Name of the song is Holy.
It's called Holi Aire.
Okay.
I will send you the link because I know you collect these.
Yeah, I do. Yes, and thanks for telling that, reminding the audience that we have a Spotify playlist with all the songs that have been selected by my guests. I'm looking forward to listening to that. That's great. I hope what this podcast will do is connect people. We are connected, connect you with the audience. I also am going to connect you with the previous guest.
Yeah, I guess my question would be, how are you raising the clamor about what moves you or inspires you? Raising the clamor on these issues that are of importance to you.
It's a great question, and I hope that my answer doesn't feel like a cop-out. I think if you had asked me this question 5, 7 years ago, I think I would be raising the clamor in almost like a shouting from the rooftops way, right? Like, tell everybody why can't you understand it? Don't you see how dire these issues are? I think those strategies have mixed success. I think what I have found works better, or at least currently is more of my practice in terms of raising the clamor, is by looking to connect with people and asking thoughtful questions. Something that I often like to say, and I'm not the one who said it, I've sort of repurposed it. Change happens at the pace of relationships. And so I think when we can be in relationship with each other, when we can ask thoughtful questions, much like you're doing on this podcast, when we can seek to really listen for that connection and that understanding, I think it becomes easier to help people see different perspectives of the same picture, and then to raise the levels and raise the clamor on getting people behind the movement, whether that's sustainability, whether that's issues of diversity, whatever that may be. Yeah.
Your question for the next guest.
I talked a lot about leadership in this conversation, and it's something that I'm thinking a lot about as we talked about Maurice. I think one of the things for me, I consider myself a lifelong learner. I'm always looking to see what I could do better. And so I think a lot about what's my learning edge or what's my growth edge. And we also talk about in our work, we talk about that with others. So my question for the next guest is, what's the next thing that you're looking to learn? And what's your leadership or your learning edge in your leadership journey?
Love that. Well, you are from the States, so you probably I'm familiar with him. Steve Hartman of CBS. He examines, or he has examined, I don't know if it's finished now, but how one simple act of kindness creates a ripple effect. I have two questions about this. What are your thoughts about, the potential of a simple act of kindness in terms of rippling effect? And if I would ask you, and the second question is, if I would ask you to commit one simple act of kindness this week, what would it be?
First of all, I agree. I think a simple act of kindness certainly creates a ripple effect. And I think, again, I think I'm probably making this much simpler than maybe is intended. But I think it can be as simple as looking somebody in the eye and smiling or acknowledging them even as you pass them in the hallways, in the streets. We hear a lot about the connection, like the yearning for connection, particularly coming out of the pandemic. The loneliness epidemic, we hear about it in many different ways. And I think sometimes we fail to see each other, just to see each other, let alone connect. And as we talked about, that connection is really important for change happening. And so I think a simple act of kindness is as simple as you're walking, having a smile on your face and looking people in the eye and just acknowledging each other's existence.
Why do you get out of bed in the morning?
I was not expecting this question. You've stumped me a little bit. Because there's more work to be done, right? Like there's more to learn. There's one more connection to be made, one more change to happen, or to push the change further, right? Again, these are large intractable problems. We're not going to solve them in our lifetime, but that's not a reason not to try. And once you achieve the first goal, then push the goal to the next edge, to the next post.
Yeah, these conversations always go fast. So but what I still want to ask you, is there a question that I did not ask you that I should have asked you during this conversation?
I don't think so. I think we've covered a lot of ground.
We did.
Yeah.
We did cover a lot. But maybe there is still something that you would think, no, you should ask me this. But if there is not, that's also fine.
Yeah, no, I think we're good.
You good?
I really enjoyed the conversation, Maurice.
Great. Yeah, I would like to thank you then for today's conversation and for who you are and what you do. And I also really like how you answered, the question in terms of the clamor. And I think, especially now here in 2025, there's a lot happening at so many levels. I really think if we could start really listening a little bit better to each other, and not start shouting. And I'm not saying that we should not be angry. I don't, there's a lot of stuff happening, but I think one of the reasons that we are in this mess is also because we didn't do it. So So I really appreciate what you mentioned there. I resonated with that, and I don't often give my own opinion about this, but I feel with yeah, I appreciated what you said. So thank you so much, and keep on doing what you do, Nikhil. And
Yeah. And
yeah,
if I may,
good
Maurice,
stuff. Yeah.
one, I'm honored that you gave your own opinion. And two, I think you're doing it, right? It's in the name of your podcast, Walk, Talk, Listen. And you also you ask such thoughtful questions.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. And we'll make sure that the listeners can also check out the website of your company and to check out. I mean, you're doing a lot of interesting things and together with your colleagues. So we'll make sure that we mention that in the podcast notes. So yeah, thank you so much, Nikhil, and good luck with everything you do.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Walk, Talk, Listen. Please check us out on 100mile.org or follow us on Facebook or Instagram.